in two of the passages that we just heard read today. It's as if we're listening in on conversations. Sometimes they take the form of dreams, but they're there to be conversations. One is between God and Nathan, and the other is between God and Solomon. These conversations remind me of prayers. You know, prayer is really supposed to be a conversation with God, and that means both asking for what you want and what you are thinking about, as well as listening to what God has to say to you. Sometimes it is easy for us to forget that, to think of prayer as a kind of a pious way for us to ask for our favorite song to be played, almost as if we are dialing into the American Top 40 or the Billboard charts. But prayer is something more than that. Let's take a few moments today to look at these individual conversations. The first is between Nathan and God. Now, just a little background here for this one. David has built himself a very fine palace. And then he gets to thinking, you know, we are still using for our church building, to put it in our terms, the tent, the tabernacle that the Jewish people had when they were wandering through the wilderness. I really ought to give God something a little bit fancier, a little more spiffy, you know. And he talks to Nathan about it. And Nathan said, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. That night, God comes to Nathan. He says, Nathan, you blew it. You gave David bad advice. I don't need a fancy house to live in. Instead, I'm going to make David into a house that lasts. The fancy temple, it can come later. I'm not worried about that. And when it does, it'll be on my timeline and not on yours. You know, that's essentially a theme that we hear repeated any number of times, particularly in the Old Testament, but I think also in the New Testament. It's so easy for us to think that we know better than God what needs to be done. That we don't even need to talk to God about it because we already know, so why would we talk to Him? I suspect all of us can think of times when we have done the very same thing. And then we turn to that conversation dream that is between God and Solomon. In the dream, God comes to Solomon and says, ask for whatever you want and I'll give it to you. Doesn't matter what it is. Is that a blank check? Does God really mean that? Or is this a test of whether Solomon will be a good king, a good shepherd for his people? Already in 1 Kings, the narrator has hinted that maybe Solomon isn't quite as good as maybe he could be. He says, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, only, and he throws that word in there, only, he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. There's a strand, particularly in the Old Testament, of a group who really felt that the only place that one could legitimately worship God was in Jerusalem. Irregardless of the fact that for centuries people had worshiped God legitimately in other places in Israel. Solomon recognizes that he can be a good king only if he obeys God and he acts with wisdom, God's wisdom. So that's what he asks for. It's a great start. A great start for his reign as king. But later on in the story, from 1 Kings, we hear not only of Solomon's reign in terms of all his wisdom and his wealth and his great building projects, including the temple, but we also learn that he winds up worshiping not only God and allowing all his foreign wives to worship the gods that they've grown up with. He even builds temples for them. And there's some indication that Solomon even joins him in that worship of other gods. One of the best known stories about Solomon is that story in which 2 women, 2 prostitutes, come and claim that a baby belongs to each one of them. And Solomon is called upon to decide which one is the legitimate real mother. Now we need to talk about culture a little bit here. The king is at the highest rung of society, the very top. These women are at the very lowest part of society. They have no political, no social, no economic power. This story doesn't even give them any names. They're just 2 women. In a sense, 2 nobodies. Oh, yes, it's good that Solomon is accessible to his people. That was one of the functions of a king at that time. They would have performed the role of a judge to determine, questions like this. Oh, and Solomon, he's clever. But he really, the narrator at least, turns this into kind of a spectacle. It makes a spectacle of the women. Because it's a story not only of Solomon's wisdom, but if you really look at it, it's a story of cruelty and loss and grief. And Solomon doesn't seem to recognize any of that in his decision. Will the true mother reveal her identity before Solomon has that baby cut into pieces? You know, one of the famous paintings of this story by Peter Paul Rubens has one of Solomon's guards holding this infant up by an ankle, dangling it there, and in his other hand he has a big sword. He's ready for the command and just slice it in 2. Can you imagine how the mother would feel about that? What that detail does is reveal how vulnerable people are in terms of Solomon's reign. It's typical of a king of that period of time. They have absolute authority to do anything. Anything. And yet God has called him to be a shepherd for these people, to serve them. No matter if they are babies or prostitutes or widows or orphans or the wealthiest, most important people in the kingdom. Solomon's wisdom is not always tempered with compassion. And perhaps back then that wasn't considered to be all that great an idea, to have compassion for a king. And yet I think in our eyes that is certainly important for us today, that we have a king who is compassionate, because we believe we have a compassionate God. As the story proceeds here, we see that God stops using his wisdom. He literally bankrupts the country. because of his temple building program. He goes so far as to sell off part of his country to a foreign power, and that includes the people, his people who live in that area. He imposes very heavy taxes on his own people, and he makes them work on the temple as if they were basically slaves. Also, the temple can be the greatest, the most over-the-top structure that anyone can imagine. This is Solomon's big moment, this temple. Things get a little out of hand, don't they? And then we have those political alliances that he makes by marrying the foreign princesses. That was a common practice. And he allows them to worship the other gods. God allows Solomon to continue to rule. But it's pretty evident that some of the seeds of destruction are already there. After his death, his son Rehoboam becomes the king. Now, when he becomes the king, or at least claims the kingship, the people of Israel gather together and they come to him and say, if you will lower the taxes and quit making us to be slave laborers for you, we'll follow you. We'll acknowledge you as our king. We'll follow. We'll lift you up. Rehoboam refuses. He says, I'm the king. I can do anything I want. I don't care what you think. So the kingdom is split up. This kingdom that everyone had been so proud of, that all the people of Israel are united and that they have this territory that they rule over, and this is God's kingdom, is torn apart. Which started with such great promise is now ruined. Well, like Solomon, like Rehoboam, we can often twist things to meet how we think it ought to be done. Fortunately, we have a God who forgives us, but he also has some expectations of us. He does call us to listen to him, to seek his will. A scientist and professor by the name of Robert Trivers wrote a book called The Folly of Fools, the Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception in Human Life. In other words, we're good at lying to ourselves. But he tells a story in there about a friend of his, a man that he considers to be really someone who loves God and seeks to do God's will as much as possible. The man asked Trivers one day, do you pray? And Trivers said, oh, yes, I pray. Well, how do you pray? Well, I usually pray the Lord's Prayer. And then he got thinking about it. And he was raised in a church, and he remembered from his childhood how the Lord's Prayer always was said at church services. And it came out something like this. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. Trivers says it rolls right along like that, almost as if we are telling God where he is, what he should be doing, what we expect of God. His friends kind of shook his head and said, I don't think that's the way to pray that one. He said it should really be about our humility, that we seek to know and to follow the will of God. Trevor's thought about that a while, and he said, you know, I have never prayed the Lord's Prayer in that old way again. Perhaps what these stories of David and Solomon and Rehoboam do for us is to challenge us, to remind us that we are to frame our vision of our lives and our futures, not in terms of just what we want, but what God wants for us and for all of his people. That we can truly be the people who follow God. We need wisdom, God's wisdom, and we need to live by it, so that we will not only start well, but that we will finish well. In Jesus' name, amen. Let us stand.